Kia ora tātou katoa, which is a greeting in Māori, which is the indigenous language of the country that I come from. I'm glad you don't have to be uniting to be here, because I'm a Baptist on loan to the Uniting Church, a servant of your mission, as it were. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an enormous privilege to be driven 3 hours into the middle of nowhere. To meet a whole lot of people that I don't know. And as a principal of a college, for me these things are like gold. People have these perceptions of colleges as ivory towers, full of a certain type of theological persuasion, and it's wonderful to come out here to see whether I meet with your stereotype of a Uniting College lecturer or not. You can tell me at the end of the weekend whether I fit that bill or not. I also want to say too that the Uniting Church is a broad church, and we as a family coming from a Baptist church have been constantly surprised at that broadness of the Uniting Church. This feels a lot like home. So the number of kids that are around here, the sense of warmth and welcome, the songs you sing, it feels like home. So if I shed a tear every now and again, it might be just a little bit of homesickness. And so thank you for inviting me into this experience. There are 2 words of caution I need to bring. The first is from our Bible reading this morning. I've been reading through 2 Corinthians, and as I sat in the sun this morning, I read this. It's about Paul. His letters are weighty and forceful, but in person he is unimpressive and his speaking amounts to nothing. And I wasn't sure whether God was trying to tell me something this morning or not. If I don't do well, me and Paul can be in partnership together. The second thing I need to explain, this is a slightly awkward moment of cross-culturalness, because apparently I have an accent. Apparently I come from a different country. And when words cross countries, they tend to have a different meaning. So you need to know that the word donga has a particular understanding in New Zealand culture, and it normally refers to a part of the male that they tend to keep hidden. And I have not come across this word until the last couple of days. And so if I blush when you talk about my donga, you just need to know that that's what's going on inside of me, that I'm trying to move across cultures. Since we're telling cross-cultural stories, the things you wear on your feet, you call them thongs. In New Zealand, a thong is like a G-string. And I always have my first performance review at Uniting College, and I asked what I should wear to this performance review. And the principal's PA said, wear whatever you like, wear your thongs if you want. And again, there was just this slight awkwardness as I sought to clarify exactly what she meant and what she imagined when she saw me in my thong. I'm married to Lynn. We have two children, one who's 15 going on 15, and the other one who's 12 going on 18. And they have, so that's us. We are New Zealanders, and quite proud of that. And what else do I need to say about ourselves? So I grew up in Papua New Guinea, and then came back to New Zealand for my teenage years. And then began my first work experience on the orchards in central Otago, and then had a sense of God's call to grow not just fruit, but to grow people and to grow communities. And that was sort of my introduction really into ministry. So I went to Baptist Theological College. They had a vision for mission and for church planting, and that's what energised me. And it took them and me about 3 years to work out that their vision, how their vision for mission and church planting actually fitted with the word minister. Because both of us had quite some trouble trying to weave those two together. As a result of that, I planted a church. I spent 9 years church planting in a neighbourhood close to the theological college. That was a sort of early form of fresh expression or new form of church, if you like. And then everyone said to me that you can do creative and interesting things when you have young adults and when you have a church plant, but you can't do creative and interesting things when you work in established churches with pews. And so we moved, felt the call of God to move to a 94-year-old Baptist church that was in serious decline. They said at the meeting that called me that if we don't get this appointment right, this will be our last minister. No pressure or anything. And we had 6 years there, and they were really good years. And God did some wonderful things in our midst in terms of taking this defensive, broken, bitter group of people and making them much more outwardly focused and engaged. And so on the back of that, the Uniting Church heard about what we were doing and some of the resonances around conservative churches and conflict and looking inward resonated with some of their story. And so a number of times I came to visit with the Synod in South Australia. It was Pentecost 2009, and I preached at a Powell Baptist on when was the last time God surprised us as a church. That if you look at John chapter 3, the people of God are blown by the wind. It's a bit of a surprising thing where they end up and what they do. If you look at the Valley of Dry Bones, who would have dreamt that the wind of the Spirit would blow and that would happen? And so I simply asked the church, when was the last time that God surprised us as a church? And that week, Andrew Dutney, who then was the principal of the college, rang and said, we really believe that you're the person that we need to be our first director of missiology. And it was like God laughed, and God said, you thought that sermon was for them, but it was actually for you. When was the last time God surprised you? And a Uniting Church called a Kiwi to be involved, a Kiwi Baptist pastor in their midst. And so that was part of our call initially to the Uniting Church, the strong sense of God was up to something. God, and would we and the Uniting Church be open to this sense of surprise and unexpectedness? And I was there for about 2.5 years, and then they, in the wisdom of the church, Andrew Dutney became the president, and they were looking for a principal. And I was sitting at Henry Fulham Uniting Church, and it was a kid's story, and I was looking out the window, and I was going through all the reasons in my head why I would not be a good principal. I'm not as smooth talking as Andrew Dutney. I don't play the guitar nearly as well as he does. I come from the wrong country. I have a funny sort of accent. I blush around the word thong and donga. All these reasons why I wouldn't be a good principal. And I suddenly realised that the Bible story was Moses and Moses' call. And you know how Moses has all these reasons why he shouldn't do what he should be doing? And God just said, you'll be not Moses. You're simply giving me a long list of reasons. And all I asked Moses to do was to open his hands and to give what he's got. And that's all I'm asking you to do, is to put your name forward, to tell them exactly who you are, that I'm a bit of an innovative, out-of-the-box, people-loving person. And if they wanted that I wasn't Andrew Dutney, but if they wanted that for the next stage of their journey, then so be it. And in the surprise of God, I am the principal of the college. So that's a bit about my story and where I am at. I was asked to talk about fresh expressions, and I want to do it in a way that I've never done before, so this might and might not work. If it doesn't work, then me and Paul, he was unimpressive, and we're all together, and that's fine. But I want to do something, but first let me show you some slides or some images to try and define fresh expressions, all right? And you could start here with this photo. This is taken in the Flinders Ranges. We're up there in 2007. And when you initially approach the Flinders Ranges, it just looks dead, just masses of brownness. But if you look and pay really close attention, there are these amazing little flowers that grow up all over the place. And that's one way to look at fresh expressions, is that it's trying to pay attention to what God might be wanting to birth and to bring in unexpected places. Does that make sense? And I think that has particular resonance because of the next slide. This was taken about 2, 3, 4 weeks ago, and I was doing some work with the rural churches in the Eyre Peninsula, and that's a 6-hour drive up there, and to work with them. And we got there just before dark, before I spoke the next day. We went for a walk, and that's what we saw on the street sign. And is that what God is up to? And will that be the future of the Uniting Church? Maybe that's some of our current future. So do you see that juxtaposition between that image? Because both of them are dry and rocky and hard places, aren't they? But Fresh Expressions asks us to try and pay attention to what God is up to. Some of you like images and connect with that and like stories. Others of you like definitions. So here is a definition of what is a fresh expression. It's church for a changing culture. It's for not yet members. And it comes about through listening and service and discipleship to become mature as a church. That comes from the United Kingdom. And that raises a whole list of questions. Generally, whenever I talk about fresh expressions, these are the questions that at some point always get asked. The first one is, well, what is church anyhow? The second one is, can my church change? Should my church change? The third one is, how do we engage non-members without them or us feeling stupid? Because if we're honest, most of us around the evangelism word go, how embarrassing for them and for us. So are there ways to engage our community in ways that are life-giving and empowering and aren't a continued colonisation? Does that make sense? Without losing our belief that there is good news and that we have experienced good news. The fourth question is, what does mature look like? It's a really interesting question to ask. What does a mature church and what does a mature disciple look like? And then the fifth question is, how does discipling happen? If we're on this journey to discipleship and to maturity, how does discipling happen for us as individuals and us as a church? And normally at this point I'll put on my theological lecturer's hat and I'll start to work through some theology of what is church. Does that make sense? And then someone will say, well, that can't happen in my church because, and so we'll look at some change management principles. And then that would raise the question of how do we do mission and evangelism, and so we'll talk about that and then get into maturity and discipling. And so I'm going to try a very different approach to this, and we'll see how it goes. Do I need to do anything else by way of introduction? I don't think so. I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to try and creatively retell the Bible story from Mark chapter 1. I first wrote this story because I was told that there'll be 45 community girls joining our service one day. And the Sunday school teachers would not be glad if I sent these 45 community kids out for Sunday school. And it would actually go against the central message of welcome and inclusion, wouldn't it? Welcome to our church, now you can go out the back. And so how do I engage 45 community kids? So imagine that we are all children. Some of you will find this harder to imagine than others. Imagine that we're all children and that we lived 2,000 years ago. Imagine that my name is Jane. Yep, a girl's name. I told you that you'd have to imagine. Imagine that my name is Jane and that I'm a girl and that I've got two hands. With my two hands, I get to touch. I get to feel my favourite clothes all soft and warm and dry, especially when I'm cold at night in my donga. With my two hands, I get to touch my pet rabbit, called Stew. I wonder why Dad would have named my rabbit Stew. With my two hands, I get to hold hands with Mum and Dad and go 1, 2, 3, whee, as we walk down the street. Hey, can you imagine doing that with your Mum and Dad? When I was 8, Dad left home. I know, you're probably thinking the D word, divorce, that he'd found another woman. But not my dad. My dad loved me. And my dad loved my mum. My dad would make my mum furniture with his bare hands. And my dad would made her a garden outside in the shape of a love heart. Now, when I was 8, Dad left home because his skin began to change. He began to get these white patches on his arms. And then a few sores began to emerge, which he tried to cover up by wearing long sleeves, all tucked up. And him and Mum went really quiet, and they stopped going out, and they stopped talking with their neighbours across their fence, and they stopped inviting friends and cousins over for dinner. But that didn't stop the local village chief, who came one day and reminded Dad of the laws of our village, that people are very frightened of a skin disease called leprosy, and that it was easy to catch, and that no one wanted to catch it. And the people who got these skin diseases were unclean. And they had to leave their home, and they had to live by themselves outside the village. And they had to wear a special coat that was rough and brown and dry and hard, made of sackcloth. And then the man pointed at Dad's long sleeves and demanded a health inspection. And Mum begged and I cried, but that was it. Dad had leprosy, said the man. He was now unclean. Never again would I be able to hold my dad's hand. Never again would we be able to play rough and tumble. Never again would we be able to walk down the street and go 1, 2. Never again would he be able to make Mum a flower garden in the shape of a love heart. And so Dad left and he lived outside of our village. And we would take our food out to him every day. We'd place it there outside his hut, and then we'd back away, and he'd come out and we'd shout to each other the good things, how well my rabbit was doing, and how brave Mum was being. And the hard things, like the kids at school teasing me because I no longer had a real dad, and about how much Mum cried when she thought that I couldn't hear. But there was never any touch. No rough and tumble, no hugs, no holding my dad's hand. Until the day that Jesus came to town, there'd been these weird rumours. The stories of a sick mother who was healed of a fever, and stories of a crazy man who'd found peace in his head, and that a local carpenter from just down the next village could heal people. Which sort of perked my dad up. And it meant that as Jesus approached our village, Dad shot out of his hut. That's one advantage of living outside the village, was that he got to Jesus first. Which didn't actually please Jesus' disciples, the men called followers, who backed away yelling, "Unclean! Unclean!" And it didn't exactly please the local chief, who came running with a stick and a whole lot of Roman soldiers. And in the midst of all the yelling, in the midst of all the shouting for the disciples and the Romans and the local chief, I saw Jesus standing there. And his eyes. I've never seen a man cry before. Not even Dad when he left our home. But I swear that I saw Jesus begin to cry, and to wipe tears from his face with his hand. And then with his hands still wet, he bent forward and he touched my dad. And the crowd hissed in surprise. And the leaders roared in anger. And the disciples howled in dismay, because they were now with an unclean man. But Dad was yelling even louder, "Look, look, I'm clean!" And the crowd falls back in amazement. And he was right. Dad's skin was no longer raw and ulcerous, but it was beginning to scar and to harden with age into history. Now, some of you are probably thinking, how cool would that be? Imagine seeing your sick dad get better right in front of your eyes. But let me tell you that what came next was even cooler. Jesus was talking to my dad. Go and show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded, which meant that my dad was coming home. Back to hugs and back to rough and tumble and back to weeding the flower garden for Mum. You see, Jesus healed not just my dad, but Jesus healed my whole family. He put a smile back on my mum's face. And he put a hug back in my arms. And it meant that the kids at school stopped teasing me. And that the cousins started to come back over again. And it meant that our family got invited back into the village community once again. 1, 2, 3, whee! As we walked as a family down the street. Dad and I would often talk about that day and about who this Jesus was and about where he went when he left us, because he just kept going. You see, after he'd gone, some people began to call Jesus the great healer. And they'd point to my dad and they'd say, look, he's all clean. And they'd tell stories about the other healings that Jesus apparently had done. And then very quietly, when the local leaders weren't looking, they'd whisper, who else can heal but a God? Which was true. But for our family, that was only a small part of the Jesus that we'd seen. We'd seen Jesus get emotional. He'd wipe tears from his cheek. But a God can't cry, can it? A God can't have feelings, can they? And we'd also seen Jesus break the law. With his hands, he'd touched an unclean man. Not by accident, but deliberately in front of the whole village and community. And a God can't break their own laws, can they? And so Dad and I used to argue together. And then one day, the priest began to talk in church about God making the world. And it was pretty boring. And I was counting the circles on the roof. One of 101 things to do in a sermon. Until Dad nudged me. And as I listened back again, the priest was talking about the story of God making human beings. In Genesis 2 and verse 7, the Lord God formed the human from the dust of the earth. And I began to imagine, a bit naughty I know, but imagine this picture in my mind of God forming 2 legs and 2 arms, sort of like mud cakes, patter, 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 blow in and bang. Hello, Adam. And then a bit later on in Genesis 2, verse 21, the Lord God took one of Adam's ribs, and Dad's looking at me. And again I realise that it's like God is touching, making and moulding. And it made me think of that verse I learned when I was really young in our Jewish kids club. We are the clay, you are the potter. We're the work of your hand. And I began to realise, this is my discipleship, that my thinking about God was wrong. And that God actually wasn't all white and living in heaven and writing books with lots of don't touch written in them. But that God actually works by touching, by getting God's hands dirty. And that when I'd seen Jesus, I'd actually seen God, who shares love and who heals hearts and who restores families by touch, by getting hands dirty, unclean. Which meant that Dad left home again. but this time with Mum and I. You see, we took to the streets and we shared the story with anyone who'd listen, of this God who touches sick people, of this God who gets hands dirty, of this God who brings families together. I began by asking you to imagine. You might have heard of my dad. In 165 AD, they remembered him in Rome. You see, this flu epidemic, massively bad gastro, had swept the Roman Empire. And over 25% of the population in Rome died. And amid all the panic and the hysteria, many chose to run away, to flee for the hills. But not the Christians. They remembered my dad, and they chose to stay and to get their hands dirty in that city and to care for the sick and the dying. I asked you to imagine. Imagine that my dad's name was Luke. Dr. Luke, healed by God to be a healer, who then wrote stories about a God who heals through touch. May somewhere in here be the word of the Lord. What is a fresh expression? What is church as it emerges from that story? How would a church change as you think about that story? How would you engage non-members without us or them feeling stupid as you think about that story? What does maturity look like? And how does discipleship happen? Can you see how you can do it theologically, but you can also do it through a story? I'm going to give you 6 options. Option number 1 is you can go for a walk. Because sometimes stories get people in our guts, and we need to go and spend some time with creation and telling God about what's happening inside our guts. Some of you over here, if you want, can talk about what is church in 2s and 3s as it emerges from that story. Halfway down, can I take this halfway down without it squealing? From here up, you can talk about, can church change based on that story? And from here down, how does discipling happen? From about here down, you can talk about how do we engage non-members without us feeling stupid from that story. And here up, what does maturity look like? Or you can simply go for a walk. Does that make sense? About 5 minutes, and then I'm going to invite us back together and I'll hear some of your feedback. Do it in pairs, otherwise we've got all these awkward chairs moving. Is that all right? Time together around this story. May the Holy Spirit continue to be present in our conversations.